Welcome, Jan. I'm so excited to have you here with us today.
I'm excited to be here.
Well, we will go ahead and jump right in with our first question here, which is, so your book, Hannah's War, was inspired by the true story of Dr. Liza Meitner, the real physicist who was the inspiration for the character of Dr. Hannah Weiss. How did you first learn about her and ultimately make the decision to write her story?
Okay, that's a great question. It takes me way back. I am also a screenwriter. In fact, Hannah's War is my debut novel. And I was in the New York Public Library doing research for a screenplay. I was writing about the women air service pilots in World War II called the WASP. And I had an idea that I really wanted to just see how the coverage was of the day the war ended. And of course, that was the day that we bombed Hiroshima, officially the end of the war. And so this is how long ago it was. It was in the microfiche room, and I called up the microfiche, and there was, this banner headline. So many people, rain of ruin, fire from the sky, Truman vows death to all enemy. It was, shocking and horrifying. But then what was fascinating is that the New York Times basically had to tell the entire world about the secret history of the development of the atomic bomb, because it had all happened under wraps. No one knew about it. So no one knew about it until it was dropped. And so I was reading, the history, and below the fold, there was a paragraph. It said the key component that allowed the Allies to develop the bomb was brought to the Allies by a female non-Aryan physicist. And I stopped reading, and I literally felt as if this unknown, mysterious female Jewish physicist had reached through the screen and grabbed me by the lapels and said, I've got a story. You have to find me and you have to tell my story. It was very consistent with the things that I've loved to write about, which I often write about women who have been erased from history. Like the women air service pilots whom I was researching. That really set me on a mission to find this woman, and I did. Her name is Dr. Liza Meitner. She was Austrian, and she was working at the highest levels in Berlin in the 30s as Hitler was on the rise. And I mean, there were so many extraordinary things about her story that I was immediately hooked. I mean, the idea that a Jewish woman was working with a man, her collaborator, her lab partner, who was not Jewish. She was the only woman and the only Jew at that time in the institute. As the Nazis were rising to power and as their pressure on science was becoming more and more about making the science into military discoveries that they could use to defeat the Allies. So that kind of confluence of events was so fascinating, and they reached the point where she had to flee within 6 hours of being taken to the camps, right at the point when they were about to discover nuclear fission. And so there was such a great story with a ticking bomb and drama and this incredible genius woman at the center. And originally I was going to write it as a screenplay, but what ended up happening was I got so interested in the rest of the development of the atomic bomb, because the German part was really only half of the story. The story, not even half, maybe it was a third of the story, because the real story was the race between the Germans and the Allies, the Americans. It was the Germans discovering nuclear fission that to sort of put the pressure on FDR to develop the Manhattan Project, because everyone was terrified that Hitler would get the bomb first. And so by then I was captivated with the whole world of Los Alamos and this race and the politics of it. And I was off and running. It took me quite a long time to figure out whether it was a screenplay or a book. I played around. I did many outlines. And in the end, the reason I decided to write it as a novel, I had always wanted to write a novel, and I had written, I'd say 2 novels that were probably 2/3 ready for publication, but I never took them all the way. This, I felt, had the potential to really go all the way. I also think it could be a great, great film. But in the end, I felt like the character of Hannah Weiss, she's suspected of being a spy. That's kind of the beginning of the story. That's what incites the whole story. And she's by nature kind of a guarded, slightly mysterious character, because she is keeping secrets, and those secrets are very important to the suspense of the story. What is she hiding? And I thought, the great thing in a book is you can have a character keeping secrets, and you can have access to her inner thoughts through a first person voice. Not to use all the time, but just a few, if I need the audience to the viewer, to be on her side, I can just open up her mind a little bit. And in film, I'm sort of used to this idea that the heroine of a film, particularly a woman, has to be likable, and likable often means not scary, not mysterious, not guarded, but sort of perky and beautiful and available and warm. And I just was like, here this woman has been buried in history for almost 75 years now. I don't want to unearth her and have a screenplay that never gets made because she's not likable enough. And so I thought, you have very interesting, mysterious, unlikable women in fiction. From Anna Karenina, M. Bovary, it goes on and on, Olive Kittredge, and fiction's a good place for a heroine like that who's keeping secrets. So.
Yes, and it's so fascinating because her story may have continued to be untold if you hadn't gone below the fold in that one little tiny phrase.
Yes. I mean, it's actually shocking. I've been on tour with the book by Zoom, because it came out right at the beginning of COVID. But I've actually talked with people in physics, graduate students in physics, even women who do not know her name. Now, I don't want to go too far afield, but I will say that one of the reasons she is not known is that she did not get the Nobel Prize. And there are some, some really misogynist and really upsetting things that women will identify with, that I identified with completely. She and her male collaborator were at work, not only were working at least 50-50, but I would say that she was probably slightly more of the driving force intellectually behind what they were doing. But because they were working under this Nazi regime, they couldn't put her name on the papers that were published, because immediately the experiments would have been labeled what they called Jewish science, and Jewish science was verboten under the Nazi regime. Then as they closed in, she had to flee. They continued working together, but her male colleague, Otto Hahn, was working in Germany, and he was the one who still had access to the lab. She was in Sweden with, very little equipment. She didn't really have a place that had taken her in, but he couldn't work without her. And so what he would do is he would do these experiments. He would write the results and he would send them via postcard to her in Sweden. And she would analyze what had happened. And so she was snow skiing with her nephew in Sweden. And I love this because what a movie moment this is. Puzzling over this, experiment, and it just didn't make sense. And she stopped still in the snow. She used her ski pole. She started like drawing equations in the snow with her ski pole. And she said, I know what happened. The only way to explain these results is if we split the atom. And what happens when you split the atom is you release more energy than what is actually there before. So when the atom splits, it doesn't just split into two that are the same, it splits into two that are have more energy. And so she made the discovery, and he published the paper without her name. Then he was offered the Nobel Prize. She was in the audience when he accepted it. And I was reading in her diaries, and she wrote, I am so disappointed that he didn't even mention my name. And then I felt even more of a passion to tell her story, because that's the story of so many women who have what they've done appropriated, or the credit goes to the man because they're working as a team, or they're married and the husband becomes the one who's the genius. And here it was, just so bald, so was right there on the page. And the scientists of the time actually knew it was her, because the scientists lobbied the Nobel Institute to give the prize to her, but the Institute wouldn't. And since then, I wanted to try to get her a posthumous Nobel, but they don't do that, just on principle. So I really felt an obligation to get her story out, because it's an amazing story, and she was an extraordinary woman.